Moving on with the news, and Syria has accused Britain of meddling in its internal affairs. This after British Chancellor George Osborne's remarks on the need for using military force against Damascus. The Syrian Foreign Ministry says it sent letters to the United Nations to protest against the standpoints taken by British and French officials. Osborne said on Saturday that the UK and Europe must tackle the conflict in Syria through military intervention. Osborne also described President Bashar al-Assad as evil. London has attempted to join the so-called international coalition against ISIL terrorists in Syria and Iraq, but it's run into fierce opposition by the country's parliament. French media also reported earlier this week that Paris was considering airstrikes against Syria under the pretext of targeting ISIL, also known as Daesh. Damascus has accused Britain and France of pursuing a colonialist agenda. And joining us from Washington is Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian. Thank you very much for your time, sir. Are we hearing the beating of the drums of another war? What would be the impact of the UK joining this anti-ISIL coalition?
Well, it would be devastating for Britain and for the world. I would just like to point out what we're seeing is a response to the fact that the Iran nuclear accord will now pass through the American Congress, barring a war or some unforeseen false flag terroristic provocation or Gulf of Tonkin incident. Obama now has 37 votes in the Senate. He may even get to 41 votes. One way or another, the Iran nuclear accord, which of course involves the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, Germany, all of Europe, that is going to go through. Now, the warmonger forces, seeing that, have lifted and shifted. They have now switched their attention to Syria, attempting to cynically use this refugee crisis. And I would point in particular, the poor little boy, the toddler that we saw on a Turkish beach, is a victim of Erdogan of Turkey and of the King of Saudi Arabia that we just had here in Washington. And by that I mean it's Saudi Arabia, of course, who paid for the Syrian rebels, and Erdogan, the cynical butcher of Turkey, is somebody who won't let the refugees take the normal overland route into Europe. He forces them to go in the water. He forces them to take these tiny boats and dinghies and go across to the Greek islands. So this is a real cynical warmonger strategy, because then they play that back into the Western media. Now, it's 2 years after the Ghouta chemical weapons fraud. And we know all about that now. That was another Saudi-Turkish co-production. Saudi provided the raw materials, and Turkey allowed that to come through their territory, right? We got the whole world to the brink of war just about 2 years ago. Now, the British, as you say, with Osborne, and the French with this leak in Le Monde, seem to be going back to this insane policy of aggression against Syria, except now something has changed. There are now lots and lots of Russian advisors on the ground. There are people there, we've been told, I think my website is probably the first news medium in the English-speaking world that reports the existence of a Russian-Syrian military commission with all kinds of officers on the ground, and of course the 6 MiGs that have now been there for 10 or even 15 days. So now, if you're Britain and France and you go back to this insane policy of 2 years ago, you're going to find Russians on the other side. This is absolute madness, incalculable folly, and people who understand what's going on in the world have to rise up against it. I would just point out one thing. Here in the United States, we've now got a Democratic Party frontrunner, at least in New Hampshire, whose name is Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie Sanders has been extremely fishy and evasive about his policies on war and peace. He has supposedly made speeches where he says that Saudi Arabia ought to solve the problems of the Middle East. Well, that is simply absurd. And I would call on Bernie Sanders, and I urge others to do the same. Bernie, you've got to come out and make a speech that says, hands off Syria, hands off Ukraine, no more wars, because now you have the responsibility of being the Democratic frontrunner. You've got to accept those responsibilities and do something now to prevent these madmen from pitching the world into a new Holocaust.
Well, Webster, talking about these interventionist policies, the warmongering policies, it looks like this particular penny is taking an extraordinarily long time to drop. All these interventions has led to what is happening in the Middle East right now, and yet let's bomb them some more.
Well, it's always been the saying here in Washington that a neocon is a one-trick pony. In other words, they have only one answer to any situation, whatever it is, and it's always war or escalation of existing wars. So this is not surprising. I also have to point out, inside the Democratic Party, we've got the humanitarian bombers. We've got people like Samantha Power, that is to say, Mrs. Cass Sunstein, representing the United States at the United Nations. She's a dyed-in-the-wool, inveterate warmonger. Her ultimate policy is the same as any neocon. So this cuts across the borders. But you notice that if the Iran nuclear accord goes through, that makes a different world. In other words, it's not going to be so easy for these one-trick ponies, these discredited neocons, to continue with their old racket. They're going to be shut down in many ways. So I think they say, well, the Iran nuclear accord may well go through the U.S. Congress, but they'll try to abrogate it with a war. And I don't think they're going to give up until they're thoroughly exposed and thoroughly expropriated as far as their political power is concerned.
Thank you very much, Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian, joining us from Washington.